A History of Christian Zionism. Donald Lewis in his work says that while dispensationalism and John Nelson Darby, the pre-trib rapture system, has been important for Christian Zionism, especially in America, Lewis argues that this influence, specific influence of Christian Zionism, is very recent within the broader Christian Zionist movement and history. And he also says that Darby himself cannot be considered a Christian Zionist. And even when looking at Crawford Gribbon's work on this specific topic of the pre-trib rapture system, he says that dispensationalism today in America is much different than the older American dispensationalists, and even the older American dispensationalists Americanized Darby's system itself. Lewis says that those who drew from Darby's system itself, they became politically active Christian Zionists by significantly modifying Darby's teaching to insist that the restoration of the Jews would happen before the rapture, and they organized politically to enable this to happen. In Lewis's work, he says the doctrine of restoration, which Jews back to the homeland, is an innovation of the second generation of the Protestant reformers. Now, when looking back to the early church, you can find fathers such as Irenaeus in his Chiliasm eschatology, and he had the belief in a future temple being rebuilt. Even going back to the 4th century, you can see the emperor who was trying to reestablish the Jewish temple, and the Christians at that time thought that rebuilding the temple was blasphemous. Lewis gives examples of certain figures who saw a future restoration for the Jewish people to the Christian church. But really the foundation of the Zionism, he points back to Theodore Beza. And this is the figure who came after Calvin in Geneva. Lewis writes, though he didn't see a physical restoration, Beza did see a spiritual restoration of the Jews to the Christians at the end of the age, and he's drawing this from Romans 11, in the all of Israel will be saved. And so during the time of Queen Mary, you have the English exiles going to Geneva, and they would eventually put together the Geneva Bible, and they were influenced by Beza. The Geneva Bible was very influential at the time for British and American Protestants. It is somewhat the first study Bible, and the notes on Romans 11 following Beza instructed readers that this was the nation of the Jews joined to the Church of Christ. Lewis says that many Puritans then, as a result of this, believed Paul was speaking in Romans 11 about a large-scale conversion of Jews at the end before Christ's second coming. He says the Geneva Bible speaks of the Jews not as a people, but as a nation. And Lewis says that from this language, it is possible that it would lead some to believe that the Jews would possess their own land in the future. And this is interesting. John Bale, who had the first full-length English commentary on the book of Revelation, Lewis writes in his commentary, he introduces a new field of thought concerning Jews and their place within Christian apocalyptic hope, arguing for the national conversion of Jews to Protestantism. And you even see this kind of connecting to nationalism and God using certain nations to bring about his will. And a lot of the apocalyptic literature and thought during the time from the Reformation up had three groups in mind: the Roman Catholic Church, the Turks, and the Jews. Lewis says the eschatological position of the American Puritans can be traced back to John Cotton, who is a post-millennial historicist following the lead of Thomas Brightman, which was the dominant Puritan view in England. And we also see a historicist premillennial named Increase Mather and his 1669 publication, The Mystery of Israel's Salvation. And that was the first American school of thought that advocated the national restoration of the Jews. Lewis shows 19th century British evangelicalism, restoration really starts to turn into Christian Zionism. And after the Napoleon Wars at the end of the 18th century, you see a rise in the historicist premillennialism. And so this premillennial historicist position made the physical return of the Jews the event that must happen in order that Christ might be king over his people in the future coming 1,000-year millennial reign. In the early 19th century in the English-speaking world, you really see a rise in premillennialism. You see around the time of 1830, John Nelson Darby presents his idea of the pre-trib rapture at the Lady Powers Courthouse. Lewis says even at this time within dispensational circles, they did not have a high view of Zionism because they believed that the rapture of the church would happen before the Jews returned back to their homeland. Darby's theology was that the Jews are God's earthly people and the church is God's heavenly people. The church age is a parenthesis and God's dealing with his people Israel. And within this system, there's a future 70th week of Daniel that is entirely focused in on Israel. For Darby, the rapture was imminent. Within this, what was called New Premillennialism, they saw that the rapture was imminent, and therefore they saw the church being taken up before Israel was back in their land. Lewis writes, while Darby and the exclusive brethren, which is the split that happened of the brethren movement, and this is Darby's sect, they believed theologically in the eventual establishment of the Jewish homeland, but Darby did not teach that it would happen in this age, but only after the rapture of the church. Darby didn't lift a finger, Lewis says, in trying to usher all this to happen to get them back to the homeland or whatever else because the rapture was imminent. It was more of a sit back and wait. This talks about the one who really brings about Zionism and connects it to dispensational premillennial eschatology was William Blackstone and the Blackstone Memorial. This is the first official request to an American president for a Jewish homeland return in March 5th of 1891. Blackstone was a dispensationalist, a missionary who believed that the restoration of the Jewish people to the land of Israel was necessary for the return of Christ. And American Christians should actively seek to enable this to happen politically. And since this time period, Zionism is still much broader than the dispensational eschatology. Daniel Hummel says that the theology of the dispensational doctrine underlies a lot of the Christian Zionist movement, but not all of it.